Hello, thank you for watching. Looking down here, this is from a polar orbiting Sentinel satellite looking down at California. This picture here is from early April, I think the first week of April here. One thing that jumps off the page to me, and at least this picture here, is how green it is. Certainly compared to, I think, most years in April. And I think that's a product of how much rain we had, at least in the second half of the water years, especially for California, and then the snow. In the Sierra Nevadas over here on the right side of the image. There's Lake Tahoe here, Central Valley running through the middle of the screen, the Bay Area down here on the bottom left. Very green on the left side of the image, on the top right, very white. This is kind of your recipe for a better water year. We have more water in the bank, and then the banks on the image as well, right? We have all these reservoirs here that show up as these the water spots on this big picture here. So that was early April. I'm going to catch this up now to present day, or at least 5 days ago in early May here. And that's how much the colors have changed just in about 30 days here. If you look specifically at the Sierra Nevadas here, top right of the image, I'm going to flip back and forth. It's kind of neat to compare the two. Just in 30 days, you can see how much of that snow melt we've already worked through as that season has begun. But even if you look at closely at some of the foothills, you can see the colors changing. We are transitioning from spring to summer as we speak. We're starting to see the colors change across the state. I know something to watch for some of these foothills when they have that dark green, lush color to them and they start to dry out at this time of the year. We can see some of the pest pressures move down into some of the agricultural valleys. So that's always something to watch for as well. When I was in California just about a week ago, I couldn't help but notice how green some of these the foothills were. Even just kind of a week and a half ago. So I think doing quite a bit better in terms of that water situation. We can see that even from space. It's abundantly clear just how different of a water year we've had in California, which I think is good news that we've achieved that without some of the snowmelt flooding issues that we had last year in May and June. Kind of below this image off screen is the Tulare Lake bed, but I don't even need to show it because it is not flooding the way it was at the end of last year. If I jump over and catch us up to present day here, we are seeing this trough here lingering across the western U.S. If you look closely, this is a water vapor satellite imagery looking down across North America. This trough isn't really going anywhere, doesn't have a place it's headed to at the moment. It's just kind of sitting and lingering over Idaho, Montana, Wyoming as well. Kind of keeping an eye on this to see what other impacts might have across the western U.S. At least right now, kind of obvious ones if we jump over and look at visible satellite imagery. Keeping temperatures down across the northwest, across parts of the interior west. We had some frost advisories in western Oregon, active frost advisories here in the upper Snake River Valley as well due to some overnight cooler temperatures. And then showers, some rain showers here in northwest Montana. We've actually had some blizzard warnings in some of these upper elevations here in Montana with some snow that's been falling with heavy winds as well, all a product of this trough. East of the divide, this is a large upper level trough here in spring. We've had, unfortunately, quite a bit of severe weather that we've been dealing with as well. Tornado warnings, tornado watches. Unfortunately, we have a flooding risk today in parts of the Mid-South, getting up into the Ohio River Valley. So big weather-making system. I think for the West, its influence is waning a bit. So while it is positioned across Wyoming, parts of Montana, we do have some of these cooler temperatures. As we get into the forecast, I think we'll see this start to weaken in influence across the West, maybe giving way to a little bit more of a pattern change in terms of bringing some warmer and drier weather. If we look at radar here across the western U.S., looking down kind of at that same region, you can see those rain kind of mixing with some snowflakes here in parts of northwest Montana. Some of the mountains here getting snow and blizzard conditions. And then if we look over here in Idaho, some of that now getting into eastern Idaho as well. So that's a product of that trough there. Not much else to speak of across the western region here on this Wednesday afternoon. I want to jump over. This is the European model forecast. I'll make this valid here as of this is Wednesday afternoon, looking at the jet stream level winds. So we want to get an idea of where is that trough going, what kind of influence is it going to have on our weather, and then getting out into this weekend, what kind of weather can we expect, where might we be going next week. So if I take this in through Wednesday evening into Thursday morning, you can see that trough not moving very far, but it's also not looking as potent as well as we go overnight into Thursday morning. So it's still kind of positioned over Utah, parts of Colorado, Wyoming here, but not looking as potent as it was just a few slides ago. If I take this out into the future, you can see kind of this weak remnant here, still over Utah, still over Nevada, likely keeping temperatures down a bit, maybe some cloudiness, showers here in the interior, but not a huge weather maker or something that I think we'll have to talk too much about. If you actually look toward the north and northwest of it, you can see this kind of weak upper level ridging What I mean by that is kind of upside down U, or this ridge in the jet stream, trying to push in now to parts of Washington, Oregon, southern British Columbia, likely trying to dry that area out a bit and make it a little bit warmer. So we have these kind of competing influences here going into the weekend. That's through Saturday, and now Sunday. If we take this into Sunday evening, and now Monday, we can see a more pronounced ridge now starting to push in somewhere near the northwest, Washington, Oregon. And that builds in really as we go through next week into Tuesday and Wednesday. That makes this a 7-day forecast at this point. That's kind of your classic West Coast ridge here, where you have this ridge in the atmosphere. Upper levels of the atmosphere, we could expect warmer, drier weather in through this area here. So that's what I meant by something of a pattern shift, where we're kicking troughs out more into the central U.S. and less over the western U.S., which is what we've been dealing with so much of here in March and spring. That's why we saw those dark green colors in California, and then the snow in the Sierra Nevadas as well. If we jump over and look at the 7-day temperature anomalies, I think it reflects what we just walked through in that jet stream forecast here. Warmer across the northwest, warmer over parts of California and Nevada, including parts of the interior here in terms of Montana, western Montana, and parts of Idaho too. Not the warmest forecast we'll see in terms of a departure from average. When I showed you, we kind of had that weak trough trying to push in here this weekend, and then starting to get all the way out into next week before we had more of what I'd call a more traditional West Coast trough to bring temperatures up even a little bit more. So not talking about, a huge heat wave, but definitely going to feel warmer than what we've dealt with, I think, over the last 30 days or so. If we look at the 7-day temperature anomalies over that, precipitation anomalies over that same time period going out into Wednesday of next week, much drier here across the northwest than what we were dealing with just a little bit ago in spring. And that includes parts of California as well. Just kind of a pattern shift from what we've seen. I'll quickly walk through the precipitation forecast from the ECMWF. Usually I spend at least a few minutes on this as we kind of break down each event coming through, but this one I don't think we'll have to do that as much. If you look here, this is the blizzard conditions that were impacting parts of the upper elevation in Montana. We have snow showers closer at lower elevation here. We'll take this forecast in through Wednesday evening. Then through Thursday, you can see just some of those interior showers lingering over parts of Utah and Nevada. I think that continues Thursday, and then Friday a little bit here in the Sierra Nevadas, maybe some parts of the Basin and Range in Nevada and Utah. But again, this isn't your huge weather maker that's going to dominate the forecast conversation over the weekend like we've seen. Take this through into Saturday, weakening all the while, that influence, and then Sunday as well. Not much other precipitation to speak of across the region. If I take this into Monday of next week, not really too much to talk about. Tuesday, Wednesday, don't really have anything on the horizon here until maybe getting out all the way to next weekend. There's some kind of hint of maybe a weak trough here just off the California coastline. If you saw just some of those weak shower green swaths here moving through central and northern California. Not even confident that we're going to get some precipitation out of that, but it is something to keep an eye on as I walk through the long-range forecast here in just a few slides. Look at the upper level height pattern. This is from the ECMWF ensemble, getting us an idea of where these ridges are going to be positioned kind of over the next week or two. If I take this out through the middle of next week, you can see some of that ridging here over parts of the western U.S., keeping this area warm and through California, Oregon, Washington, maybe even parts of Idaho and Montana as well as we go through the middle of next week. If I take this in through the end of next week and then into next weekend, still seeing this ridging pattern here across the western U.S. Now, maybe this time, if you look really closely, that ridge centered maybe more over Idaho, Utah, western Wyoming, and less over California and Oregon. Might be seeing something of a weak trough trying to push in here as we get out toward the end of next week. That is the middle, kind of pushing into the last 2 weeks of May here. Not seeing a strong signal of this, not seeing a high precipitation signal or a high cold signal from it, but at least maybe something to bring the temperatures down a little bit as we go out toward the end of next weekend. This is from the ECMWF ensemble. If we jump over and look at the GFS ensemble, we can see that I think a little bit more if we go out near the end of next week. See something more of a U in this height pattern here, something more of a trough here, trying to sneak in here to parts of the west coast. Could increase your precipitation chances by a small amount, but doesn't look like one of these big weather makers that we've seen maybe if this were to come through in March or early April. In fact, if you look over the interior, still seeing some ridging here also from the GFS across parts of Idaho, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico as well. So we might get something of a cool down here at the end of next week for areas along the west coast. I think we stay warm in the interior as far as these forecasts. Jump over and look at the 8 to 14 day outlook. This is from the Climate Prediction Center. Looks pretty similar. Kind of talked about through mid-May toward that the second half of April. Warmer in the interior, maybe starting to cool a little bit back to seasonal along the west coast here. If we're going to see that weak trough move in. As far as precipitation, not too much to speak of. Again, maybe just slight increase in precipitation chances. Again, through that same time period if we do get that weak trough setting up across the west coast, but nothing too significant. This is sea surface temperature anomalies ballot as of yesterday here. This is going to look pretty similar to what we've been talking about here through the springtime. We have this developing La Niña here in the central tropical Pacific. Not a La Niña yet, but it's starting to look more and more like that. We'll talk about the forecast there in just a second where I think that's going to go. Another thing I've been watching develop along with La Niña, I mentioned this last week, is this blue horseshoe that you can see here off the west coast. I call it a horseshoe because if you kind of draw the blue shape, it kind of looks like a sideways horseshoe there. That's what we call a negative PDO, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. Another piece of that we've seen, I think, grow in magnitude a little bit is north of Hawaii. We have all this warmth here in the north central Pacific. I think this is working in tandem with some of the colder temperatures off the west coast here to bump the jet stream up and over Hawaii. We've talked about that this year. That has brought troughs into the west coast. That's kept temperatures cooler. It's kept these kind of frequent scheduled rainfall events moving through. I think that's also played a role in bringing more severe weather to the central U.S. as we've seen these troughs eject off the elevation here along the continental divide and cause all sorts of severe weather and chaos toward the east there. We're going to be watching how this plays out. I think it may come into play in the summer a little bit. I think this influence will wane as we go into the summer months proper. But I'm watching it for now because at least up to this point, I think it's helped to keep the west a little bit cooler than otherwise over the last 2 months. If we just look at the height anomalies averaged over March and April of 2024, here's Hawaii down there. We can kind of follow the jet stream as it works its way through these height anomalies here. And so really over the last few months, we've seen the jet stream working a little bit like this, where it jumps up and over those warm temperatures in the north central Pacific and dives down into a trough across the western U.S. This has at times caused some of the rain that we've seen in parts of California and Oregon, caused some of the cooler temperatures that we've talked about. We talked about frost advisories, freeze warnings, etc. And if you notice in the forecast, it's starting to shift away from that pattern a little bit. Maybe in the long range, started to see something of a weak trough try to redevelop here off the coast of the west coast, but definitely not talking about this big cool down with frequent precipitation. So going to see how this plays out going through the summer months here, if we're still going to see the same setup with cooler weather across the west coast. I think there's a chance that this cooler water here keeps temperatures down just along the west coast, maybe more so than the interior. Kind of a year that I think looks maybe a little similar to what we're dealing with in May of 2024. Is if we go back to May of 2020, it was a year that we had a developing La Niña in the central Pacific. If we look here, some of these cooler waters stretching a little bit further out into the equator, maybe not quite as anomalous. And then we don't quite see what I'd call as extreme of a negative PDO. We do see these cooler waters here off the west coast, maybe not so much off of the Oregon and Washington coastline. Do see some of that warmth here north of Hawaii. And if we kind of look over the height anomalies that year in March and April, somewhat similar. I wouldn't say glaringly similar, but definitely similar in that you had a jet stream up and over the warm waters over the northern central Pacific, diving down into these troughs or cutoff lows near California. Something of a similar March to April pattern. Now that year, by July of 2020, sea surface temperature anomalies north of Hawaii got very magnified, a little bit north and east of Hawaii. Don't quite see that cooler negative PDO signal now off the west coast, but we do see that La Niña developing pretty strongly here through the summer of 2020. That year we had a pretty warm temperature anomaly pattern in the western U.S. But just look at temperatures from July to August of 2020. See certainly across the Four Corners, even parts of Nevada and California looking at a warmer than average summertime temperature regime. If we look over at precipitation over that same time period, had a weaker start and eventually monsoon year as a whole in 2020. That's kind of similar to what we've seen in some of these long-range forecasts where we've had a weaker monsoon predicted and more interior warmth in the forecast, at least over the Four Corners region stretching up into the interior west. We had new forecasts come out from the ECMWF on the just a few days ago here. Wanted to show those. This is for the June, July, August temperature anomalies, again from the ECMWF seasonal model. And consistent, I think, with that forecast kind of thought, experiment that we just had with more heat over the Four Corners region, Nevada, pushing up into some of these interior western locations. But we do have those cooler waters near California. I think even cooler than we had in 2020. We just compared that to July of 2020. And that could help to keep the immediate West Coast a little bit cooler while the interior heats up, maybe akin to what we saw in the monsoon season of 2020. So less of a monsoon expected, at least now in terms of the seasonal forecast, what we're dealing with over in the Pacific, and then more heat in the interior, but perhaps a break from the heat here over the West Coast. I think with some of the precipitation we've had, that could work to keep the wildfire risk lower over in that area as well. Jump over and look at the July, August, September precipitation seasonal forecast from the ECMWF. So I just kind of push that window out 1 month. You can see that monsoon forecast not looking as friendly, at least if you're rooting for it, for areas like Arizona, the Four Corners region, western New Mexico, parts of southeastern California, southern Nevada as well. And that's consistent with that heat forecast that we've seen build in over the Four Corners region as well. Talking about La Niña, certainly that negative PDO signal we just looked at, that kind of blue horseshoe or blue banana off the west coast of the U.S. that tends to develop in tandem with the developing La Niña. That kind of sea surface temperature picture is looking La Niña-y. It's another thing we've talked about. You have that negative PDO signal. You have some of these cooler ocean temperatures developing near the Galapagos and Peru, pushing out into the Central Pacific. This is what La Niña looks like as it's developing. I think the question going forward now is what sort of La Niña are we due for? And at least from the new ECMWF ENSO forecast, that is a forecast out and through 2024 of whether we'll be in a La Niña or an El Nino, we still see this agreement from a lot of these forecast members that we'll be in some sort of a cooler temperature regime in the Pacific, getting down into something of a weak La Niña. There's a lot of spread here, though, maybe even more so than I expected with this forecast update here in May. We see some of these members here, maybe a significant portion, I'd argue, dropping down into certainly a moderate, run-of-the-mill La Niña down here below the -1 anomaly in Celsius. Some of these staying closer to a weaker La Niña, something maybe more of an ENSO neutral, slightly toward a weak La Niña. And then even some of these on the positive side. This one, we might want to just toss out, but that would have us in an El Nino, back into an El Nino this fall. I don't think that's very believable, but I can't say it's impossible. Maybe a 5 to 10% chance, just given what we see in the spread here. So there is quite a bit of spread. To me, those sea surface temperatures look La Niña. They look like a classic developing La Niña. I think that's the expectation going forward, is that we're on our way toward a La Niña. Right now it's looking maybe more like a weaker La Niña, but we can't rule out that we could get something of a stronger one with more classic effects. We'll see where this develops from here. I'd like to have more confidence at this point here in early summer as to where exactly we're going with ENSO next year. Unfortunately, it's just not the case. When you get overconfident in these ENSO forecasts, they tend to embarrass you. I'm going to try to avoid that this summer, but I can tell you that I think it's more likely than not that by the time we get to October, November, we're talking about something of a La Niña in the Pacific. It's just a matter of, is it a weak one or maybe a more moderate one? I think that's my last slide here. That's all I have for you all today. Thank you for watching, and until I talk to you all next week.